What's up, guys? It's D22-soso, Wayne Chung of the Professional Gamer Podcast. This is my VIP guest, Matt Place. It's been a long time. First met you like over 20 years ago?
Exactly what I was going to say, yeah. I feel like it was at a pro tour Long Beach.
Oh,
At
probably.
some magic
remember-
tables, doing some
remember-
drafts. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you were there.
Yeah.
I remember the setting very well. That might have been the one Roger Veer got top 16 in, actually.
Okay. Yeah, it's been so long. I'm not sure because I think you were there when I went to visit Neutral Ground in California.
Oh, yeah,
I
Mountain
used
View.
to play there with I forget his name. The pro Starcraft player starts with a G.
Gaddington? Jay Severson?
Yes.
He'd rather be known as the CTO of chess.com now. He wants to graduate
Okay.
from his kid status, but I'm embracing my kid status now since I have other higher level stuff, but it hasn't gotten enough prominence yet. But this is Matt Place, 2-time Pro Tour winner, one in teams, another one solo. Who was your team's Pro Tour with?
Yeah, so the team was it was Worlds. So, so it was myself on the team, Mike Long, George Baxter, an old school name for people, and Dennis Bentley, who was the national champion that year as well. Yeah.
And what deck did you win the solo Pro Tour with?
Solo was draft. So it was the last Rochester. And if you remember Rochester, right, it's totally insane. Every booster's opened up and laid out on the table. So you see what everybody's drafting. So the skill goes through the roof. But so does, now that I'm a game designer, I'll give the other perspective, so does the unfunness. Like, just knowing what everybody's drafting, having so much information, people getting mad at you for good reason often, right? But yeah, I started off that Pro Tour, sat down, had some other old school names there. Matt Vienno, if you remember him from Canada.
Sounds familiar.
Anyways, yeah, an old Control Magic gets opened up. Pack one, pick one. There's Legacy's Alert, which was actually a very good limited Control Magic.
So it's Tempest and what else?
Tempest Stronghold, right?
Tempest Stronghold. Okay, I have mental picture for the audience.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, Mark Lepine was sitting to the left of Matt Vienno, or maybe it's vice versa, and they're both 2 and 3 to my left, right? And so I'm 8th pick. Control Magic gets open. I get an 8th pick Control Magic. I'm like, all right, this can be a good Pro Tour here. Here we go. Yeah. Start off well, and a blue flyer, so it's a good start.
What were the main colors for Tempest Stronghold? I don't remember, like the color combinations that were good. I mean, so red was good, right?
Red was good. So a lot of the power was focused in black, like they like to do back in the mid '90s, right? All the pestilence sets, right? There were multiple sets in those surrounding years where you could have 2 people go mono black in a draft, and those would be first and second at the end of the draft, right? Black wasn't quite that good, but black was super powerful. It had some of the best buyback. If you remember,
Justice and Disturb Burial, yeah.
Right, yeah. And red had decent ones. Searing Touch, things that could pick out, right? And it was a deal 1 with buyback if you spent 5 mana, which was actually pretty good because 1 mana deal 1 sometimes makes the cut, in random draft formats. With buyback and having so many unblockable 2/1s and 3/1s in the format, it was actually a very good pick, right? In late game, it sometimes just was like, oh, I need to do 5 more damage. Well, over 3 turns, I can just throw this thing at my opponent. It was actually in my deck in the top 8. But yeah, it's funny, you look back, like, how lucky do you have to get to win a Pro Tour? How lucky do you have to get to make it through all those rounds, right? And I have so many memories of just how lucky I got, right? The top 8 was almost very unlucky. So top 8, Rochester once again. So the guy who's sitting directly across from me is Chris Bishop.
Who's going to be your first round opponent. The
right,
person
he
who sits
knows
across
that.
from you. Yeah.
Right, and he knows that. So I'm going red-black, my favorite 2 colors in the format. Getting lots of good buyback. I actually got a 4th pick Living Death. It is not just the best card in the format, it is by far the best. Pierre Kroger, a German, this was in Germany. The German who had first pick at it was playing black. He took a unblockable shadow creature over Living Death. Huge mistake. Like
I vaguely remember reading about this actually, and I had a debate with John Sasso, who's the CEO president of Channel Fireball, the best set or best card in Tempest, and
for
I
draft.
did say For draft, and I did say living death, but yeah,
Oh yeah,
go on. Sorry.
you're 100% correct. 100% correct, not close. There's some other amazing cards, but living death is just insane. The way I like to talk about how you know when your opponent has living death, right, is you attack with a 4/4, 3/3, and a 2/2, and they go, my 3/3 blocks your 4/4, my 2/2 blocks your 3/3. It's like, oh, I guess I'm dead. You're making terrible blocks, therefore I lose. Because living death, for people who don't know, it basically says graveyard and play swap. So everybody in play dies, and the graveyard comes back. So you want all your guys to die, and you can make terrible blocks to make that happen. But anyways, yeah, I got a 4th pick, living death, so that's pretty good. But I started feeling sick to my stomach in the top 8. Chris Bishop I'm taking red black. He's drafting COP red, COP black.
Ooh.
It's just, and I'm watching him pick all these up, and I didn't remember how many he got. I think in the end he had 5 totals, like 3-2 split. I remember thinking like, wow, I make top 8 and this is how I lose. Just COP red, COP black, and he main decks them, of course, because if he wins his first round, that's another $5,500, right? And yeah, it just made me feel sick to my stomach. And so we're playing, and he gets the 11 lands. There's both COPs out, and I'm like, how do I win, right? Well, Searing Touch, the card I brought up earlier, he was at 1 health, right? He's at 1 life. I say health because the games I'm working on have health. He's at 1 life. I have Searing Touch. I'm trying to figure out, is there a way that I can actually make a massive attack, do the buyback over and over, forcing him to COP down? So I'm just waiting for him to tap some of his 11 mana, right, trying to figure it out. And real quick to back up, actually, he was at 3. So I'll tell you what a rules lawyer was. Some people will hate me for this. I was a massive rules lawyer, so here we go. He's at 3. I got to get him down to 1, right, so I can actually do the Searing Touch synergy. I attack with Vampire Bats. If you remember this one, you had to pump it for it to deal
twice. Yeah.
Right. You pump it twice.
Up to twice. +1 +0, maximum twice. Yeah.
Right. So he has no flyers, and I'm just attacking because there's no reason not to. So for 4 or 5 turns in a row, I'm pumping the bats, and he's COP blacking them. I'm saying done, right, because I'm just drawing lands and more useless red and black cards. And eventually I send in the bats, and I'm like, okay. And he's like, yeah, COP twice. And I go, okay, hold on. Charlie, who was the head judge back then, Charlie Catino, if people remember him. What happens? I didn't pump my bats. He's got 2 mana in his pool. Is he allowed to COP the bats? Charlie rules that he goes down to 1 from 3. Yeah. And this was the way I won back in the day. It was a different world. But, letting the judge kind of team up with me there. So I got him down to 1. And eventually did the Searing Touch. He was short 1 mana, game 1. Game 2, I sideboard in 1 island and 1 of the Sleight of Mind that I'm now forgetting the name of. Mind something, but it's the Sleight of Mind with buyback, if you remember it.
Mind Bend? Is that right?
That sounds right, yeah. And because he's going to just COP me and potentially it's going to go to decking, right, that type of matchup, I decided just to put in 1 island and this 1 blue card because I'll eventually draw my whole deck, right?
Right.
But of course, game 2, I just go island Mind Bend in my opening hand or whatever it was, right? And just wreck him immediately, right? Because it was permanently changing the color word. I could change it from COP blue to COP white, and of course, just demolish him game 2 and 3. But yeah, so that felt good, right? The guy taking all the COP reds and blacks, I 3-0 him on top 8. Whew. Yeah, it's crazy.
So we have a mutual friend, Brian Weissman, who mentored me in Magic back when I was a little one, and he was a big proponent, and you too, about being a rules Nazi. I remember vaguely him mentoring me on some of these rules things, like I guess in the timing for healing salve, there was like a damage prevention phase.
Right.
So
yeah, right. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
You could wordplay. I don't exactly remember what he taught me or what he did, but he did educate me, and I think your name came up too on the wordplay to get people to screw up this phase, and then the judge would rule in your favor. Yeah. Right.
So back then, the rules were not clear on it's essentially ethics, right? But like, what is okay and what's not okay when somebody's making play errors? Can you get them on it, or is it something where they get to back up because their intent was correct, they just weren't executing it properly, and a judge might rule in their favor, right? And of course, that also depends on the level of the tournament. Back then, it was the Wild West, and we didn't have those guidelines of like, hey, if somebody picks up their Thawing Glaciers before their end of their turn, even though it says it in a turn, what is the ruling, right? And today, and the proper way to rule that is to say, oh, this person just made a mistake, let's go back. Their intent was not to end their turn. Let's follow intent more than be rules Nazis, like you say, or rules lawyers. But back then, that was not made clear, right? So a lot of the skill in the game wasn't just what is the right play, what's the right line, right? But also, do you know what the cards do and how to make them do it, right? And a huge piece, you bring up healing salve, a huge piece that people did not understand, even the head judges at tournaments did not understand well, and I could give you a few of these examples, was how does damage prevention work, and how does it work, the difference between instants and interrupts, and what is their timing, and how do they resolve, right? And so without getting too deep into it, literally, I think there probably was 4 people on the planet that you could have trusted to understand this back then, right? It was just totally insane how confusing it was. Healing salve specifically, because it was damage prevention, it could only occur during an interrupt or damage prevention step. So once you started doing that, instants were not allowed. So if I'm casting healing salve on my guy and my opponent wants to cast a lightning bolt, he has to wait until we're totally done with this step and then move forward to whatever the next step was, which was generally the second main phase. And so, except for times when Magic had a post-combat resolution step inside of the combat phase. But anyways, and people didn't know that, so they're timing their things wrong. They're trying to respond to things they can't respond to, right? I'll give you another example that may not make any sense anymore, right? Because the rules are so different. But basically, had a situation where I have Blood Moon, so my opponent can't cast any of his blue cards. He has all multi-lands. I have a disc in play. I want to cast a second disc. So I announce the second disc. My opponent cannot
never announce disc for the
right.
young kids out there.
Right, comes or play tap, but once it's untapped, you can tap to blow everything up with lands, basically.
Yeah.
And planeswalkers probably too, I guess, since they didn't exist back then. And so from my opponent's perspective, he's like, okay, yeah, you can have a second disc. That doesn't matter. One will blow up the other, right? And then I say, okay, if you're not going to counter it, I would like to respond to my disc while it's on the stack with my other disc to blow up my Blood Moon and all of his stuff in play. He's like, okay, after that's done, I'll counterspell your second disc. That's not how the rules worked. Interrupt step. Once you're done with interrupts and you're into instants, you cannot go back to interrupts. And of course, this made no sense to anyone. Like, the disc blew up the Blood Moon. Why can't I cast Mana Drain? Right? It's like, this doesn't make any sense. It's like, well, that's the rules. And it was true. It was accurate. But of course, that got ruled against me a lot because only 4 people on the planet know this stuff, right? There's just tons of confusing things. I'll just do one more. At Worlds, actually, that Worlds 96, my opponent attacks with a Regenerator that I'm having trouble with, right? Eventually, I draw Bloodlust. Bloodlust says +4 attack, +4 power, -4 toughness, but cannot reduce somebody below 1. So it can't kill a creature, right? And so I block his Regenerator. He cannot regenerate because I didn't deal enough damage. It's different than now. He could not regenerate. And at the end of the turn, I announced, okay, I want to Bloodlust your guy. It will take him down to 1 toughness with 1 damage. We've already passed damage prevention because you have to do damage prevention back then when damage is being dealt. And so he cannot regenerate his guy. We have, 5 judges at the table. Eventually they rule in my favor. But it was a lot of this type of stuff where it just didn't occur to people to read the rule book and then try to interpret what this means, right? Like the healing salve thing was very unknown, even though it became very well known, a year or two later, right in the later 90s. And then, of course, the rules changed in 1996, I guess. But yeah, it was a lot of the game back then. Yeah.
It was a huge Wild West, and this is like kind of the raw era that is documented basically through stories. And Brian Weissman obviously wanted to constantly tell these stories. Yeah. So in the mid 90s,
storyteller. He remembers them all. Yeah.
Yeah, he remember, and he recalls stuff, and I think you're gonna recall stuff that I don't even remember, and Roger Veer recalls stuff that I don't even remember, but I know it had to have happened because I know you guys. So what's interesting is Magic is kind of like a little bit of the gateway of live poker, whereas the online esports are kind of like online poker. So because that a lot of the physical stuff takes time to figure out too, a lot of stuff that you, Brian Weissman, Mike Long have has done a lot of it's been adopted in the physical world setting in poker. So I feel like in the 1990s professional gaming was at its infancy and being pioneered with Magic the Gathering. It was the Pro Tour for Starcraft. They just started having tournaments with the $1,000 and then eventually $10,000 level, and that's where we were the first generation of professional gamers and entered the playing field. So with accolades like yours, winning Worlds, Team Worlds, and Pro Tour winner, and then how much money did you make during these things?
So a lot of my money actually came before the Pro Tour started. So there was a bunch of, when I first became friends with Weissman back in 95, 96, it must have been 95. they ran a lot of like $1,000 tournaments around California. And so my little brother, Dan Burdick, who also has worked at Wizards, designed some Magic cards. We had free flights, essentially $10 flights, because our mom to this day is still a flight attendant. So we'd fly around to these tournaments where you could actually win prizes, right? Iowa City, wow. Yeah. Just all these places that actually had more than like $500 for a tournament. And so, yeah, I had really good luck with those. Basically, the tech they had in California versus the tech we had in Missouri, they were a little behind in standard, right? They knew about Necro, but they didn't know about Armageddon, Black Vice, Winter Orb, etc. So did pretty well in I think I won like 4 out of the 5 tournaments we played in over a couple weeks for an average of probably over $500 each. So, which was just a ton of money to me back then. It was just like amazing, right? A lot of the prizes were, Black Lotus that you had to then go sell. But wow. Yeah. But yeah, I think I won somewhere around 60,000. Half being Pro Tour, half being just these random tournaments where you could win a grand or so. Yeah, actually, my brother Dan, when he was 14. He went to 1995 Nationals, occurred the same weekend as the Dragon Con $25,000 tournament. So this was before the Pro Tour. So giving away $25,000 in one Magic tournament was unheard of. So he flew to that one with parents because he's only 14. And I went to Nationals. So we were going to try to both win them. And I got something like top 16. Maybe I got 9th. I didn't make top 8. But he won the Type 1 down there as this 14-year-old kid. Wow. So at that time, he might have been one of the most, if not one of the most highest paid Magic players. It was like $6,700. He came back, bought me a computer, gave me a couple thousand in cash because we were splitting our prizes back then. So yeah, it's pretty awesome. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Like Brian Weissman said, he only won like 8,000 something, and then you winning 60,000. How long was the time span that you won?
It was about 3 years. So I stopped playing. I stopped focusing on Magic basically at the beginning of '98. I don't know if you know this game, but Starcraft came out. I think it was February 1998.
Little familiar.
And, yeah, I went all in on Starcraft. I was never as good as you, but yeah, that trophy you have, I believe I made top 64 in that tournament. Taking a game off of Gurr, if you remember, the very best player back in those.
Patry, yeah.
Yeah. And he was way better than me, but yeah, I consider myself to be a tier 2 StarCraft player back then. But yeah, I loved it. Played a ton of StarCraft. I kind of just lost focus on Magic for a few years there, about 5 years actually. Poker came up, right, and started playing poker for a living, and then got back into Magic 2003. Back then your rating just was like kind of, if you didn't play, you were just still top rated, right? So you remember this? Like, yeah,
I know my DCI number. The thing is, like, my Magic for me was like my, I guess, 4th competitive game. So I would just pop in the scene whenever I wanted to, like dilettante. So, you, Brian Weissman, and Huixing Shui and others, like, had a really big influence on me. Just to get me up to speed, because turn-based games, it's easier to get up to speed than real-time games, which you have to focus. So yeah, I can remember things, and you guys have experienced many more sets than me. So I only remember the sets I participate in, but I can remember those things.
Right.
So like when you recall stuff, like I kind of get a hint, but it's never like it's never as like clear memory like you guys do.
Yeah.
For Magic.
Yeah, so speaking of memory, you mentioned Huixing Shui. I hope I'm pronouncing his name at least close. Awesome dude, great deck builder, right? Back in the day when there wasn't really net decking as much, he would come up with just wacky ideas. So I remember going to Sasso's $1,000 tournament. Speaking of $1,000 tournaments I won. And Hui also made top 8. He had a 4-color Necro deck, and I had a 3-color Necro deck. So you're both playing like these decks that you never see, right? Probably not documented anywhere, just totally insane decks. We both make top 8. It was a pretty big tournament too. Like, I don't know if there was 100 people, but there's a bunch of people there. And it was, I remember the finals was super fun. So it was basically the first time I combined Force of Will and Necro, right? Turns out that's a pretty good synergy. Force of Will being the, pitch a blue, spell anything. Necro being draw your whole deck for free. And it turns out these 2 cards are very good together, right? It would go on to work with some other people to make Necro Donate, actually. And so we're in this tournament, and I forget the name. It was Sasso's friend also made the finals.
Jeff Simino?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I forgot his name. Yeah, Jeff. And we're in the finals, and we get to a spot where it was basically I was playing Mystical Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, just a bunch of tutors, Necro, right? Because your card economy doesn't matter as much when you're playing Necro. Mystical Tutor is phenomenal, especially when your card economy doesn't matter because you're down a card, but it's a tutor for instant sorcery. And so basically I try to set up a balance and then Necro back up, right? So we're in the finals, last game. I balance away all of our permanents, right? Everything goes away. And everybody's watching. They don't know what my deck is. And then I Necro for 7. And he's got nothing. I got nothing. Necro for 7. And it's 4 Force of Will, 3 blue cards. And everybody's just like, what, did you switch decks? Like, what is this, right? So I remember, I loved the Wild West of Magic when there was no net decking. You could build just all these crazy decks and advance the tech. That's what I miss so much is like now with all these pro players, right? It's so hard to go, okay, everybody's got what they've got. I'm going to show up to a major event where a whole bunch of Brian Kibblers and super talented players have been practicing for and blow their minds, right? It's next to impossible now. It's not impossible, but it's next to impossible. Sure. As opposed to back then, it was just, who knows what's going to win the Pro Tour, right? PT1, where Necro should have been either probably best, but maybe second best after Winter Orb. Very few people, right? Only one made the top 8. Very few people were playing it as a percentage of the field, right? And in hindsight, it's like, well, obviously that's arguably the best card, right?
Right.
The balance, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
So that's basically what happened with Starcraft too. There were no replays back then. So a lot of the, me, Guillaume Patry, aka Gur, Maynard, Jay Severson, Gaddington, just like we invent our own stuff, and it's not really documented, but us four and probably a couple other people, Zilius, Tom Cadwell at Riot, we pioneered like all of the basic strategies, and of course naturally everything's going to evolve and improve, but all the fundamentals and basics were off what we did. And even to this day on Reddit, like people noted that I was a non-Korean world champion. There was 2 others, Jay Severson and I guess somebody recently did it, but like he messaged me on Reddit and he's like, oh, like the double hatchery, when did you come up? And I was explaining like this was a natural progression, because first, as you play Zerg, it's a Zergling rush, then you learn Zerg Muta, and then when somebody starts countering that and you don't have a strong enough economy to fight, then you start getting away with stuff like early second hatchery. So if you're not exposed to these things, you don't even know they exist, just like what you're talking about for Magic. So the first couple of years where I was I did well in StarCraft, obviously all the top players had their own like sticks that nobody else had saw, so it was really exciting. Now that there's replays, it's much harder to
execution is the separator more than being inventive now, right?
But I think like execution wise, and this is one of the inspirations for this podcast, is the Wild West does help. Like that kind of training for people like you and me and our generation helped us during territories that are unknown, which
totally.
So of course you got into game design. I recently got into game design and other stuff, but yeah, so like when in this world there's still a ton of incomplete information. It's just more things are more known now than they were back then, but that training, it was just in that era was just like the Wild West for like all this stuff.
Couldn't agree more. Totally. Yeah, it's very interesting. So there's something happening right now that is the Wild West, and people like what we used to be are going to be the ones on the forefront figuring it out, and there's not a lot of eyeballs on it, right? I don't know what it is. Maybe we'll know in 5 years, right? We'll look back in hindsight, right? Kind of the whole, it's similar, not the same thing, but similar to investing in Facebook before they're known, right? Like there are things like that going on, right? And for me, that definitely was game design, right? Started that in 2003, started working at Wizards of the Coast. And it's amazing how much more is solved now, right? It's not to the point of what you would call StarCraft with replays, right? It's definitely not. The way you measure that is how many games made by smart people come out and fall on their face, right? There's still, the world is still full of those, right? Artifact is the one that, whatever that was a year and a half ago,
rest
right?
in peace.
Right, but yeah, super smart people. The game is super unfun and had a very unappealing business model, right? And just fell on its face instantly. It's one of the biggest crashes you could imagine, right? You could see the numbers on Steam, right? 67,000 people are playing today. 2 weeks later, it's like under 1,000. Then, months later, it's 300, and then they stop showing the numbers. Um, but I love that. I love that so much more. I still enjoy StarCraft, right, as a tier 4 player, whatever you call me now. But it is so much more fun to try to get into stuff that is, you can turn over a rock and find gold, right? Like there is so much unsolved still in the game design world, right? With new genres,
Yep.
right? When auto battlers come out, well, what is the right way in 7 years, right? Kind of imagine in 7 years, are we going to look back and go, yeah, those first auto battlers were a lot of fun, but then the code got cracked by this one that came out 3 years later. Like, what will they know? What will those designers know? So that's actually what I'm working on now, is an auto battler with some Magic pros, Josh Uderlayton and Matt Nass and some other friends. You may not know those names. Those guys have become famous long after we were playing Magic. But super smart dudes. But yeah, I love that feeling, and it's something I encourage people to do too. Is like, what are you passionate about? What are you ahead on? And you can be one of the people to be basically, fight through all the confusion, right, and break ground on. And and it turns out it's not only rewarding, but it turns out, financially it can be very rewarding too, right? Because a lot of the things that you might be passionate about now, the world's going to get exposed to, right? StarCraft was that back in 2010, right, when it was at its heyday for esports, right? Not only was esports having ground broken back then, but StarCraft's popularity just skyrocketed. It had always been a pretty famously fun game since 1998, but once there was a way to watch it, right, and once there were good casters, right, Tasteless and Artosis, awesome
Shout out
dudes,
to them. Yeah.
right, just explodes, right? And so what's next on that, right? Obviously esports exploded after, when StarCraft kind of laid the groundwork. What's next, right? What are you going to be passionate about, a random person who's into games or into whatever, that the world is going to catch up on? And another example of this, I think, is just Magic for, basically 18 years, whatever it was, 20 years before Hearthstone comes out, right? So there's people like us who might have loved Magic in the 90s and knew it was great. And you saw hundreds of millions of dollars coming into Magic, over those years, right? It was a big deal. But just how big did the concept of a collectible card game, deck building your own deck and then battling somebody get once Hearthstone gets launched, right? And suddenly tens of millions of more players know they love this game. So the seed that you could kind of observe was how crazy people like me, people like you were for these types of games before they were mainstream, right? Yeah. And that kind of shows this potential energy. Once a game like Hearthstone comes along, kaboom, right? Now suddenly there's $1 billion a year or more going into collectible card games. So, and there was for Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh as well. But you know what I mean, for the actual playing of the game. Yeah.
This is something we knew in the 90s would happen, but, as many people our generation lament, we were too early, but it's like we can't choose when we were born in or where we were born in. We just have to roll with the punches. So one thing you mentioned, you won like $60,000 over the course of 3 years. Obviously, even with the lower cost of living back then, that's not a living, averaging $20,000 a year. So that's where, and for me, it was like, it was nice because I was working for Dennis Fong, gamers.com. I had a salary of $28,800 a year, plus that year, I guess documented winnings was like a little over 11,000, but I won small tournaments as well. But just like even $50,000 a year in the cost of living back then, that's like, and you have to keep up with competition. It just wasn't going to happen. So let's get your story on how you moved on from competition.
So basically the competition was right after high school. So I started playing competitive Magic when I was 18. Discovered the game a little later than people like Weissman, right? 1994, June. So the game had been out for, was that 9 months almost? And I started playing in tournaments, won a few hundred here, a few hundred there. Went to college and then dropped out of college because I was like, why go to college? I can win $255 playing a Magic tournament. What's the point of school? Turns out, worked out. But so did that for about 3 years, and then kind of just fell out of love with Magic for the competitive part. There was a cost to being in a different city every weekend or two. You know what I mean? It just kind of wore me down. And so like I said, I started getting into poker as a major way to try to make money, and that was a lot of fun for a while. I would say about 2 years. But once the math was not as fun to learn about, and just the ups and downs, right? Like you've played more poker than me, but the way I describe it to people is part of why I don't think poker's for me is, you win 5,000 one week and then you lose 3,000 the next week, and you just feel so bad. I don't know if that's true for you, but for me it was.
I have higher endurance than average, but I'm
Right.
nowhere near the top echelon. And the thing is, like, uh, my case is different because I can do other things.
Sure.
So recently, so I'm one of my jobs, presuming the reopen after COVID, is being a house player, and it's very low stress. But I also do other things like live at the bike and have another company, and you have a lot of other skill sets too. So people like us, we don't have to play poker for a living. So
Right.
if we hybrid it, in which, like, obviously playing the highest stakes is incredibly stressful, and you got to love it, you got to stay on top of things, and you just don't know what's going to happen because people are always going to, like, adapt back at you. So yeah, while my tolerance is up of the highest end, or of the highest echelon, but not like
Sure.
absolutely top,
Right.
it's not fun. Like, I could play the mid stakes now, and if I'm kind of spoiled now, so if I get buried a little bit, I'm like, oh my god, I can't take it, when I used to, like, lose a ton
Right.
more.
Yeah.
But it's much more tolerable.
Yeah. Okay.
And then Magic, similarly, as you said, maybe the variance caught up to you, or just like you could prepare for something so hard and then just get like very low results, and
Right.
it's
Right. 'Cause
so
the variance, right. And that's, and in some ways it's harder in Magic, right? Because if there's a pro tour today and then the next one's 2 months from now and you don't perform well today, right? Or you only get 64th and get $400, you get to pay for your plane ticket and your food or whatever, if that. Yeah, it's rough. But yeah, like, yeah, so winning 5,000 and losing 3,000 was enough emotional stress for me that I wasn't enjoying it, right? And so I did that for probably 2 years, and then I would play a bunch, years after, when it wasn't my sole source of income. But for those 2 years, it was like my entire net worth sometimes is what I was buying in for, right? So it
wow.
was, to the
That's
felt at the first minute of the night. Yeah, somehow I made
not
rent.
recommended. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But that's, when I was early 20s, right? That's the way it was going. I was trying to play the
So
highest I could with the money I had.
what years
Yeah.
were this, and was it online or live?
Almost, well, so it was live for the first year or so. So online poker basically began while I was playing poker at the local casino. So I'm going to say 98 to 2001 ish
Okay.
was when I was playing poker. Um, and then I started playing a lot more online, having decent luck with that. Uh, and that kind of spoiled me for live poker, because live poker is just
Yeah.
so slow.
Yeah.
And that's basically when I fell out, was 2001. And then I started doing after poker, and I kept playing poker, right? But the hours went from 70 hours a week to 10 type of thing, right? So it's still 10 hours a week, but much less. And I was actually doing better, honestly, too, when I was playing 10 hours a week, right?
There's a very big discussion about that with Garrett Adelstein, who he doesn't play nearly as much anymore, but he's able to stay fresh. But
Right.
yeah, that's the
Yeah.
phenomenon. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. And then I started getting into, so basically I had this pivotal call, which Brian probably didn't bring up, but it was pivotal for Brian as well, for Weissman as well. We played a lot of Diablo, so loved all the Blizzard games in addition to Starcraft. And so yeah, Diablo 2 was pretty new. I believe that was 90, is it 98, 97? It was within a year of Starcraft, I think, but maybe 99. Anyways, that game comes out, and I call Brian up, and I'm like, dude, Stone of Jordan is selling for $100 on eBay. We should figure out how to basically farm the game, right? So this is pre-farming, right? Games were not farmed back then, right? Maybe EverQuest actually was back in the day. But so I call him up, and to shorten the story, turns out it was an important thing to focus on. Turns out we've done very well from kind of switching gears, going to the game design side of it. But yeah, it turns out there's a lot of money in being on the designing and farming a little bit, but designing games, right? Being the one selling the games to other people.
Right.
So yeah, we had a ton of fun. Oh, it was so fun. And I don't know if people know Diablo 2 very well, but basically there's an area called Travancore in Act 4. I hope that's true. And so we're trying to figure out, okay, with the wizard, we can teleport, we can get to the spot where there's like 7 elites, right? Kill them as fast as you can. Sometimes they have good loot. And then what can we sell it for? And it was just, I mean, it's hard to describe just how fun this was, because we could have like a $600 day, which, back then was just infinite money, right? That's still a lot of money, but back then it was infinite money. And it mattered, right? Like figuring out a better way to do a run would increase how much money you're making. So just feeling like the feedback loop was just super rewarding and satisfying. And And it did help us prepare for like what we would go on to do, right? So just like, okay, so solving games, just like Magic, right? Solving games can lead us to make money. Okay, where else can we do that? So I try to do it in other games, try to do it in other ways. But it was very inspiring, right? Just to be like, okay, this works, right? You can be good at a game and it's not even competitive, but be good at a game in a different way and have it still pay off. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
So what was funny with like the Magic the Gathering generation when they played online games like Starcraft and poker, you guys would use your last names. So I remember playing against you as Place, played against John Finkel as Finkel, Brian Kibler as Kibler, and I think that puts you guys at a disadvantage on poker because on Party Poker I would see Finkel and I think Kibler. I'm like, okay, well I know you're a very strong player, especially for that era, so I'm gonna play you accordingly.
Right.
So
you have a range before hand one. Yeah. Yeah, and I remember playing. I don't remember if I played with Kibler much in StarCraft, but I remember playing Finkel like maybe just a few weeks after he started. So we all formed this clan that was the Seven Dwarves essentially. I don't know if you remember Mario Urbina. He was an LA guy. So
if you recall stuff, I'll kind of remember terms.
So I was Sneezy, right? We were all the different Seven Dwarves. You could just make new accounts infinitely back then. So yeah, I remember playing with Finkel, and he was like very good week 2, right? So it was just so impressive how good, of course, right? He's really good at games. But yeah, playing with those guys a bunch back in the day. Worth was probably, me and Worth were the two best from the Magic world. Obviously, you're better, but of that group.
I'm technically not. I'm not of the Magic world, and you actually worked at Wizards of the Coast, and I met Richard Garfield and Scaphalias, I think in either 98 or 99. But it had to be 98 because I hadn't won anything yet, or in international competitions. So I guess Kitty Cat, who worked at Wizards of the Coast, he would.
Kitty Cat.
So when StarCraft first came out in 98, there was a top player, Kitty Cat, and Scaphalias let it drop that person worked at Wizards of the Coast. Now it's all like, this podcast is what's going to keep that name alive. And then, people in the chat would be like, is it a guy or a girl? Obviously, I don't care. I just want to play. But yeah, that's like Wizards of the Coast.
Do you know their real name? Because I have a theory on who it is. Because they're the ones who beat me. They beat me in that tournament, actually, behind you. Somebody from Wizards did.
Okay, well, you'd have to ask. Richard Garfield and Scaphalias know who it is, but sure. I don't know who it is. But there was definitely a lot of crossover between, Wizards of the Coast and Blizzard, and I don't even consider myself a competitive Magic player. I'm literally a dilettante. That's just like Brian Weissman, John Sasso. Dot my I's, cross my T's, and I just like go and compete. And luckily I made a couple pro tours with Wei-Shen Sui and Brian Weissman, and rest in peace, Steve Aldridge. But yeah, I don't consider myself a competitive Magic player. Like I said, it's like my fourth game down. So definitely take me off that Magic the Gathering list.
Poker and StarCraft, I know. What's the third one that's ahead of it?
So no, my first competitive game was Command and Conquer. I was number 1 ranked on Case's Ladder, and then Warcraft 2, I was up there, and then StarCraft's actually my third game.
I see.
And then Magic the Gathering is like, I'm obviously better than the average player, but I'm by no means,
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the connection between Wizards. I'm a little bit sad about this. The connection between Wizards and Blizzard. The StarCraft release event was actually at Wizards.
Really? Wow.
They were friends. Yeah. So the StarCraft release event was at the computer lab at Wizards of the Coast in Renton, Washington. And I remember going there and playing way back in the day. Super fun, right? The computer labs were not a common thing here in the States at that time, so it was just so fun to play live with people. The story that I heard, kind of the falling out between Blizzard and Wizards, was they had a deal to make I don't think it's like they're mad at each other to this day or anything, but just they kind of their connection kind of loosened when Wizards of the Coast was supposed to make a StarCraft
CCGs.
RPG.
Oh, RPG.
RPG, yeah.
Okay.
And I think it was basically they were slow. It wasn't as good as Blizzard was hoping. They weren't, I don't know the exacts, but it kind of, I guess was left a bad taste in Blizzard's mouth, which is too bad because it'd be fun if, they had teamed up more, right? My two favorite companies by far. And of course, Blizzard was just crazy for it. When I first started working at Blizzard, they do this kind of introduction day where you watch videos of the old school early days of Blizzard, and it's just tons of pictures of them all laying on the floor playing Magic, right? I just loved it.
Really?
Yeah, everybody here, right? All the old school, the CEO, everybody who's like high powered at Blizzard, right? Just on the floor when they're much younger, just playing Magic with each other. But yeah, so let's see, where was I in kind of the timeline?
So yeah, basically, Wizards and Blizzard and whatever. Everybody's playing each other's games.
Right. Yeah, totally. And Starcraft, just to skip forward a bit, Starcraft was huge at Blizzard or at Wizards, even in 2003, right? So the game's already 5 years old. When I started working there, we were playing Starcraft for more than 3 to 5 hours, more than 5 days a week in the computer lab. The average skill level was pretty low, right? It was for fun. We play 4v4 team events, right? And to this day, I believe that, so Randy Bueller, who was my boss's boss, he wanted to fire me when I was pretty new at Wizards, right? He's not a fan of mine, I'll just say that. And his boss, Bill Rose, was kind of the one who wanted to play StarCraft the most, right? Other than me, I guess. And so he's like, no, you can't fire Matt. Matt plays StarCraft. We have to have our 4v4. We can't go down to 7 people. So I believe my career was saved by the fact that I just played StarCraft. But yeah, super fun. I miss those days. We played till 2 a.m., come in late the next day.
People don't get from the outside is you see the same names like from certain industries next to each other, and then when you're actually in the industry, who's actually good friends don't really get along with each other. But from the outside, you're like, oh, it's just this one big happy family. It's like, no.
The good news is it's mostly happy. I think that's true. But of course, the drama is in the conflicts. But yeah, I'm always surprised how small of a world it is, right? Like when I first started working at Blizzard, one of the senior programmers, might even be a principal programmer, he's like, oh yeah, hey, what's up, Matt? We met back in 1996, and he was on the Canadian national team. And I think he won the next year on the Canadian national team with Mike Donay. Don't quote me on that, but I know Mike Donay won 97. I think that Sale is his name. I think he won that year. But it's just cool. It's like, oh, and now we randomly work together, right? And we used to play Magic together back in the day. But yeah, so I moved from poker to kind of trying to make money farming. And that only lasted, so it turned out there was kind of spikes in games, right? Where people were new to the game, they didn't have the stuff they wanted. And you could make money in the beginning, and then it would trail off in most games. I think EverQuest might have been an exception there. I know Worth, the guy who I brought up earlier, he was making money long after those, first couple of years of EverQuest, but partly because EverQuest was just such a hardcore, sustaining game for many, many years. And then, of course, you could do it in World of Warcraft when it first came out, right? People farming gold. But by then, it was more of like you were talking about, replays are available for StarCraft, so the information is more widely available. It's definitely true for Warcraft, for World of Warcraft. I made a little bit of money in the beginning, but you can't fight against, teams of farmers that are doing it for 50 cents an hour. But it was still fun, right? I loved trying to solve those puzzles. And then I moved on to start working essentially for Brian in early 2003, might have been late 2002. And he was making a ton of money. And I did that for about 3 months. He already had the business going. He was super generous in giving me, like an equal share and everything, right? Just a super good friend. But it didn't really make sense. Like, why am I getting so much money when he already built the business, right? And so only did that for a few months. And then that's when my rating for Magic was still pretty high, even though I hadn't played in many events, if any, in the last few years. They just, your rating kind of just hung out with you. Yeah. I was qualified for Worlds 5 years after I played in the last Pro Tour or whatever, 4 years. And so I flew out to Berlin. And this was a lot of fortunate events here. So I flew out to Berlin. I didn't do very well. I think I only made, I don't think I even made top 64. But I'm having breakfast, and there's Richard, who I knew as an acquaintance, right? I say, oh, hey, Richard. And he's like, he let me sit down at his table. We're having breakfast in the hotel. And I hadn't thought about it too much, right? It had crossed my mind, but it wasn't a focus. I said, hey, what should I do to get a job at Wizards, right? If I want to design games, what should I do? And so he had me contact Randy and Rosewater, right, to start chatting with them. And Rosewater was a good friend of mine already, so we were chatting, and Rosewater was excited about me. So that turned into basically an interview, and then I got hired as a basically contractor for 6 months, getting paid a few $100s a week. It's amazing what they could get away with. But I loved it, right? I get to play test Magic. So I showed up and basically was playtesting Magic. My first two impacts, you probably don't know these cards. They're totally broken. Clark Clan Ironworks is a 4-cost artifact that says sacrifice an artifact, add 2 colorless to your pool.
I remember there was like a broken deck with this.
Yeah, there's been multiple broken decks. My co-founder, Matt Nass, is the one who's, I guess, most famous for breaking that card. And I think that's in the last 2 years that he did it. I'm not totally sure. I don't pay as much attention to Magic these days. But yeah, the card is totally busted. When I showed up, that card is in 5th Dawn, which was the set that was like, had left R&D a week before I got there, but they could still change numbers if they, asked nicely type of thing. So Ironworks was 3 mana. So I built some decks with Ironworks, and my boss, Brian Schneider, is like, okay, we're going to up it to 4. It was still turn 2 kills at 4 mana in standard because there's artifact land. So the fact that you could have, 2 to 4 artifacts already in play for free, essentially, when you played this card, made it totally insane, right? Because that's, 10 mana if you sack itself just with 4 lands. And the other card that's pretty famous is Serum Visions. It is a sorcery. It was an instant. And it's still, tier 1 in many, many, many formats, right? So yeah, I changed 2 cards in that first week, even though it was pencils down, right? We weren't supposed to be changing cards. And I think for the better, although that year was just totally busted anyways. It was the year of Skull Clamp and, what is the name of the equipment that's +1 per artifact? Oh, I can't believe I forgot it. You can move it. +1 attack, +1 power per artifact. But anyways.
It's in the Ravager deck, right?
Yeah, it's in the Ravager deck. Basically, the whole Ravager package was just, through the roof powerful. Yeah. And a lot of mistakes made there. But yeah, so I basically show up when that Mirrodin block was done, other than those 2 changes we could make. And then I got to see it unfold where Magic was, Onslaught was the best-selling set of all time. And I believe Mirrodin beat that, right? Mirrodin proper, the first set, beat that record. So back-to-back record setting. Wow. And then just a horrific year of Skull Clamp, and then 5th Dawn not having a great theme, right? 5-color artifact isn't really resonant. You don't go, ooh, I can't, wait, artifacts are 1 color. What do you mean 5-color artifact? It's probably a mistake to go down that path. I understand why they did it, but and 5th Dawn has some of the worst sales relative to the sets preceding it of any set of all time. Like it's one of the biggest cliffs. It might be the biggest cliff. I'm not sure. I'd be curious.
How bad was Homelands? I remember Homelands was pretty bad.
So Homelands is arguably the worst set of all time. There's some competitors. But I like to measure basically relative to the year before and after. You know what I mean? Like what was going on, right? How good was Mark Rosehart making cards this year, right? Like, and so Homelands is competing with some pretty bad sets nearby, right? Yeah. Ice Age, as much as I have great memories with for Ice Age, if you just lay out the commons and go, let's put it in the good and bad pile, it is a pile of bad cards. It is just such bad designs, and yeah, it's just disappointing. It's a gigantic set of garbage, but so that's what Homelands is competing with, right? And but yeah, Homelands arguably the worst set. Although the flavor and some of the best cards are actually good in Homelands, so it's maybe not the worst set, but like yeah, so it's been one of the biggest cliffs. So when I got there, it was actually a great time to show up. Not that I want Magic to do bad, obviously I want it to do great, but just so much learning, right? To go from way up here to down here in terms of like public response and sales. It's like, okay, what went wrong, right? I had a bunch of information. It's like, okay, it was going great. What did we do wrong? What do we need to do next year to do better? And then so I was the newbie when Champions of Kamigawa was basically being designed and developed. So I got to be on that development team and learned a ton more. I didn't know what I was doing, right? My only skill you could really say I was good at that point was how good is this card, right? Which turns out is not good enough to be a good designer, right? Not even close. So I was helping with the balance testing. But even that can go wrong, right? Because if everything is super tight, which you could argue Champions had a little bit too much of that. There's other sets that are much worse examples of this. But if everything's too tight in terms of power level, it is less exciting, right? There's less drama, there's less fun there, right? And I think Randy had some good philosophy directionally on that. He was wrong, I think, fundamentally. But, you want your all-stars to shine, right? How do you get that to happen? And the answer is not, well, they're 11s out of 10, which we were doing way too much back then, right, with Ravager and friends. But it turns out more important is just perception, right? When you make a new flying Juzam that just looks way too good to everybody, but it's actually fair, you're cashing in on those points without making an 11, right? That card, which I'm forgetting the name of, but the flying Juzam that we made, that week 1 response was like, oh my God, everybody's certain this is a 10. When it turns out it's actually a 6, you still get a lot of fun, hype, decks being made with it, right? And then new decks to build after once you decide you don't like that card. That's almost perfect for a card to come out and do that, inspire people, but leave room for new cards to come in. So these are the things I would learn in those first 2 or 3 years from, observation and just the amazing masters that work there, right? There's just so many smart people that work there. Robert Gutierrez, I learned a ton from, Bill Rose, Mark Rosewater, Aaron Forsyth, Brian Schneider, right? Just all these people that knew so much, Henry Stern, and kind of putting it together and really leveling up in my understanding of like, okay, what does it take to make a game fun? And like we were talking about earlier, it was still the Wild West for Magic the Gathering design back then, right? There was a lot to be figured out. I think Rosewater advanced the game. One of the biggest upgrades to Magic of all time was the work that he did on the original Ravnica. I think the biggest leap that I would assign to somebody is actually Bill Rose's work on Invasion. I think is the biggest leap in like, wow, Magic is a way better game now because of the philosophy and the block, kind of the block model, et cetera, that, may not be the best model, but it was such an upgrade to what they were doing before that.
What's your opinion on that? I would have guesses, but
specifically the block model?
Yeah. Or the block model plus like why Invasion was the...
Oh, okay. So Invasion, I believe, actually, it had core mechanics executed well that are hype without too much power. It's like kind of inherent to the concept of a gold card, a multicolor card. It was done incorrectly the first time, even though we were so excited for it, which is also evidence, right? So the first time it was done was Legends. So Legends is also full of garbage. Now its top 23 designs are great designs. But Legends is such a bad set. Here's the piece of trivia I like to give to show off how bad design Legends is. How many red common creatures in Legends can attack for damage? Would you guess? Of course, it's low because I'm asking the question.
Like pure red? I don't even know. 3.
It turns out it's 1. It's Raging Bull. There's one common red creature that has power and can attack, and which is insane, right? And it's Raging Bull, which is just a reprint of Grey Ogre. But functional reprint, so real bad. But anyways, so Legends has mostly bad designs, right? There's a cycle of blow up your wall to get a little minor effect, just all these terrible ideas. Just so the glyphs, I think they were called. Anyways, but gold multicolor was in that set, right? And we went crazy for it. I actually knew how many gold cards I had. For some reason, that was what I wanted to collect, right? I was basically, it came out when I started playing Magic, so this was part of my first experience in Magic. Gold cards are cool,
right?
Invasion is really the first time that they're done really well. Mirage did some as well, also Bill Rose. But Invasion is when it became, wow, what colors do I go? When I'm drafting or building a constructed deck, if I add a third color, I suddenly get access to every tie for that color adding, right, for the gold cards.
Yeah.
Off-color activations, right? I could play this card, but if I just splash a little bit of black, now suddenly this creature is a Necrotal if I can pay the black kicker, right? Kicker, one of the best mechanics of all time, is also in there. So this feeling of like my card's potential is really high, it's super exciting, but it's still totally fair, right? A Giant Growth with buyback can be the best card to draw out of your deck in a lot of combat situations, limited, but it was totally a fair card because the buyback was expensive. So yes, when you have a lot of mana, this card goes crazy, but it's not inherently an Ancestral Recall or a Ravager where just every game is very consistently overpowered, right? And so, so I think Invasion is arguably, it's got to be in top 3 of like biggest upgrades in terms of Magic design, really paying off in terms of, players loving it. And then Ravnica is also that, right? Another gold set, but also the flavor just really kicking in for people, right? Like everybody's got a guild for each pair. The play pattern, right? The build around and play pattern, which was still not as advanced as it's going to become, right? In terms of like build arounds matter, how many build arounds did you put into a set? But it was much better in that set, right? So it kind of came together, and the art was amazing, right? Brady and Jeremy Cranford kind of directing that, coming up with just awesome lands and just great, fantastic A+ characters. So it kind of hit on all cylinders, but a lot of it was the work that Rosewater did in terms of what does it mean to be a multicolor set, and how should that play out, and what are good designs in that world. And Hybrid Mana, I think, was not the best implementation of that, but overall, I think that a lot of the new ideas in that set are just A+, and that combined into one of the biggest upgrades in Magic. Yeah, really cool.
Yeah, well, that's kind of cool. And you have quite a few sets designed. You have Planar Chaos, which I do remember playing that.
Yeah.
10th edition, you were the lead. Shards of Alara, Zendikar, World Wake. I didn't play that block. I did play Scars of Mirrodin. I did mention, for some reason, I did really poorly in that draft, so I don't know what I was doing wrong. And then New Phyrexia.
Yeah,
And
New
it's
Phyrexia, I was just talking to Rosewater a day or two ago, and I was joking with him. I'm like, hey, Mark, when you wrote your design article about New Phyrexia, this is years ago now, yeah, you listed everybody on the design team but me. He's like, what? You were on the design team? I'm like, yeah, I was on the design team. He'd totally forgotten. In his fairness, that's actually when I left Wizards, so I was only on the design team for like 5 of the 15 weeks. But yeah, that was my last set I was on actually.
so yeah, I guess developing you had a lot like the Kamigawa blocks, the base sets, time spiral, future sight, blah blah blah. So yeah, I mean that seems like you have a lot of experience with this. And Brian Weissman did touch up on what happened after you moved on, but you want to tell the audience what happened
Oh, post Wizards.
post Wizards, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm guessing the part he mentioned was his company, right? Grind Gear Games. But yeah, I left Wizards in 2010 to go work on World of Warcraft TCG. Unfortunately, at that time, it only had a few years left. Basically, the licensing was going to get pulled back. But I did that as the head of design, so the initial design. So yeah, just to go back to at Wizards. Yeah, so when I first started working at Wizards, right, there's something that I think Magic players kind of know, which is the developer and the designer, right? So the other order, but yeah, so designers kind of come up with the initial concepts, developers do the final. That's kind of switched up, right? My brother went to work at Wizards and hired up something called the play design team, right? So there's more teams now than just the first team and the second team. But that's kind of the model we followed at other companies. I worked with Mike Donay on WoW TCG and on Hearthstone, right? And we basically had that model, which was there's an initial design team and there's a final design team, right? The people who do it first, and the people who kind of perfect it, polish it, and balance it, right? And so when I first started working at Wizards, I was solely on the development side, other than the 10th edition thing, which doesn't quite count. But I was just on the development, balancing, final polish side. And then about halfway through my time at Wizards, I started doing 50-50-ish. I get more of a development, final design role, but I started being more on the initial side, especially on Rosewater's teams, because I enjoyed working with him. I think he enjoyed working with me, and it was tons of fun. So, and filled a role that was a really smart role that they started doing, which was kind of the liaison between the first and second team. So I'd be on the initial design team for Zendikar, for example, and on the final design team for Zendikar. And a lot of that meant not only did I have a full picture that I could share with people, but I also could relate. Well, here's why Rosewater did this. Here's why Dave Guskin said this, right? All the people that were on the initial design team, I could kind of relate the reasoning behind why the cards say what they mean, or translate the comments, in multiverse. Like, why did this person say this is now getting there? It's like, oh, well, we were talking about this, and we didn't like how we had Landfall before. Landfall was awful when we first started, hilariously terrible. But we got there. Yeah, I love that set. That's one of my most proud sets to work on was Zendikar. But yeah, so then leaving Wizards, I started working on other TCGs. I would go down to California to work on WoW TCG. And at about that time, Brian was looking for funding for his company, along with my friend Chris Wilson and his team out in New Zealand. And I decided to go all in and fund them as much as I could. It was a small percentage of their funding, but yeah, basically put my life savings into their company. And it turns out they made Path of Exile. Yeah, it turns out it was like investing in Facebook before Facebook is big. Yeah, it turns out they knew what they were doing. And, it's funny, we argue now about how foolish I was to put in my life savings. And I think I have great arguments for why I was right. But, and not just scoreboard.
Arguments,
not just So my argument was, I have a good job, right? The amount of money that I was investing wasn't a huge amount relative to how much I'm making a year. So I could lose all that. And it's like, no, I'm still making all my payments and everything's going on, right? Also my trust for Brian, right? This is a guy who I'd known for so long, and to some degree Chris, but I mostly knew Brian as, he's been my best friend since we first started playing Magic. And his willingness to, basically be ethical and forthcoming and whatnot meant there was low risk on that downside. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you go into business and you hear horror stories, or other people go into business, you hear horror stories about the guy took all the cards from the game shop and left the other guy, his partners, out to dry. Yeah. Knowing that was nearly 0%, I think is a meaningful part of the evaluation of what does it mean to invest in these people, right? And then, yeah, and the fact that, Chris and Jonathan knew what they were doing in terms of, they're smart dudes who know how to program, at least Jonathan. Maybe that's a bit of hindsight. They obviously did in hindsight, but at the time I felt confident in that. And then I think my number one hammer, obviously I was supposed to invest my life savings, is when I hung out with them after PAX and they were telling me the number of hits they were getting on their website before they were even showing much of anything, was 30,000 unique people a day coming to the website, just because the concept of we're going to do Diablo 2 right? The the successor. And I was like, 30,000. That's insane. Like, what the heck? So that is why I did it. What do you think?
I always have said it's about, I mean, I don't know about always, but I guess even when I was a teenager, I always look for the talent and the leadership, because there's always going to be people who hype up their own team. Like, oh, I have this all-star, this all-star, this all-star. And as we know in team gaming, that usually doesn't pan out well unless they were already friends to begin with.
Sure.
And are working together. So when you just like, and this is going to be a very common theme among like companies or startups, you have 5 resumes, they all look like all-stars. Why did they fail? Well,
right.
There's a lot of factors, and one is that people on paper aren't necessarily, isn't necessarily an accurate representation of who they are in person. And I know Brian better than I know you. Obviously, know you decently well and respect your abilities, but like Brian's somebody where just like we all have our idiosyncrasy, so to say, and when he was mentoring, he was obviously kind of harsh, I guess, in his youth, but you can tell he meant well, he cared. So I am not
super passionate. Yeah.
Super passionate. So I am not surprised whatsoever. Like basically, if I had extra income, I don't know if I could go all in like you did, but as you guys said, you guys are best friends, so it's easier. But if I had like a chunk of money and Brian Weissman was like, I want to do this project, I have no problem committing because I know the guy and the leadership. Whatever you see of him on paper, knowing the person is just a completely different level.
Yeah, I agree. And on paper, he's beyond the average great resume, right? Because what he did in Magic in those first, 18 months or whatever it was, right, where he was solving the game in a way that nobody was coming close to, right, with the deck. And there's a few people that were kind of a part of the deck in terms of, building versions of it and whatnot. But really, he advanced it to such a degree. That's such good evidence that you want to invest in a person like that, right? They can take a bunch of information, a Wild West type of situation where there's rocks to be, flipped over, and they can pull so far ahead of everyone else. That's the type of person I want to invest in, right?
Right. And that's something that, like, we've seen 20 years ago with certain people like Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, that you just like see them, you like look at their product, look at their decision making, and you're like, that guy's probably gonna win. You don't know for sure. You never know for sure because there's always upsets, and like obviously with Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, you do see the adversity they faced about just like almost losing everything, and to be able to come back from that, that's it's when people like, a lot of people are complainers. I mean, I think nobody's immune to not complaining.
Sure.
If you just keep complaining and there's no results, then you kind of have to put a little bit of the blame on yourself.
Agree.
But if you come up with results in adversity, or just like in Brian Weissman, your case for Magic, ahead of your time, so maybe you guys aren't necessarily credited with enough. I mean, you guys have achievements, but maybe not credited enough dealing with the wild West. I
think Weissman, he's got some pretty good credit for that.
Okay, well, I just mean like, I know what
you mean. Yeah.
As on a personal level, I'm not surprised that.
Sure.
And obviously, you're not surprised, and you're willing to just like
right,
put the chips on him. So with people like that, I guess it's just like we're not surprised that they're gonna do well, but it takes years, if not a decade, to manifest the project.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, why is Brian so good at these things, and why does he pull ahead? And it's interesting. I think the passion's a big part of it, right? Like, how many hours a week was he thinking about Magic back in 1994? Right, it was basically all of them. That matters, right? People who are focused do pull ahead. And I think the other piece is that I like talking with people about this is the we all know to go, okay, how can I make something more efficient? How can I look for edges? How can I look to upgrade to be better tomorrow than I am today, right? But also, and also credit, and when it comes to game design, Eric Dodds, who was kind of the godfather of Hearthstone. So everybody knows Ben Brode.
Oh, okay.
Game director, his boss, right? The game director is Eric Dodds, who has been referred to as the Dalai Lama of game design. But he encourages you to kind of back up, right? Go, okay, you got this game design in front of you. What if you take steps back, right? Before you put this feature in or that thing in, back up and say, okay, what do we got going on? Are we going in the right direction? And that type of thinking, I don't think people do enough, right? Which is what if we made a major shift? And basically, can I find places where there's a huge edge to be gained, but maybe it's not right in front of me? Maybe I have to kind of zoom out and see the big picture, right? And for Magic, that has been things like, what if Brian's big one is, what if I played very few victory conditions? What happens to my deck, right? Nobody was thinking that way, right? Reading about his deck in the magazines when he was famous and he had that full, model shot of the Duelist, right? And it's just like, he only has 2 Serra Angels. Huh? Like, what are your other 58 cards? You have 2 Serras, right? Well, it turns out you can win other ways, but only having 2 victory conditions was just so outside the box and pulled him way ahead of other people, right? And let him put more card advantage into the deck and unfair cards like Moat into the deck. And that type of thinking is important to remind yourself of, hey, I need to think that way, right? Like, what is, should I be playing at this casino where these guys are good? Or is there just something much better down the street? You know what I mean? Should I just reevaluate what's going on?
Right. Again, that's touching up on that. I'm sure you could play poker for a living if you really needed to, but you have other skill sets, bigger fish to fry. So did Brian Weissman. Again, one thing is like looking, and the thing is like, I know Brian Weissman through personal relations. I barely know this. I know some of the stuff he's done, online, but like a lot of the relation I have was in person. So like I was in a Type 1 tournament, I made top 8, and I would name drop Brian Weissman, but other people are like, oh God. I'm just like, no, it's not like, him, Brian Weissman, the guy that you read about or see about. It's like my personal relations, why I'm name dropping him. And you and Brian know me well enough that's why I'm doing it. But like that's the thing, like when you read about somebody on paper, and this happens with celebrity famous people, like a percentage of the general public's going to be haterish. They're going to be like, oh, he isn't all that, blah blah blah. Right. Whereas if you know somebody personally, you may know a lot of their actual life conditions, which may have prevented certain things, some difficulties, them facing adversity, like what they've overcome, like the depth that they go down the rabbit hole that may not get credit for. Whereas like something like game design, how do you credit somebody with game design until you've shipped the product's been successful? Were there problems with like the marketing production that weren't the fault of the game designer? For Brian Weissman, he was very well rounded as a competitor, a teacher. We hadn't seen his game design yet because we were probably too young, and we were in our exploratory phase. But he is somebody like, is he gonna be Bill Gates? Is he gonna be the president of the United States? Right. Maybe not, but whatever he commits himself to, he's gonna make his mark, and no one's gonna be able to take it away from him.
Right. And now it's hard to imagine him going all in on something and not succeeding, right? Like I was just at his house yesterday, 2 days ago, and it's just incredible. Like it shows off his success, right? 5 stories. It's one of the nicest houses in downtown Seattle, right? Indoor swimming pool, right? I mean, it's insane, and it kind of shows.
There's a lot of people I'm kind of like not surprised they're doing well, and people are just kind of waiting for them to make their mark. Obviously, I'm biased because like while I read about names like John Finkel, Kai Boudet, and I've played against John Finkel in Starcraft poker and Magic once, and Brian Kibler, I played 4 games. I played with him in Hearthstone, Magic Online, and Starcraft. Like I'm just not surprised that these guys end up doing these things. So in my network, obviously, like Dennis Fong, first professional gamer, Quake, Doom 2, Quake 2 world champion, and Jay Severson, Starcraft world champion chess.com. Like, knowing these guys at a young age, I'm just like, yeah, like, I don't know when, but shit's gonna happen.
Yeah. And so, do you know Fong from? Did he play at Neutral Ground, or where did they play Quake?
Dennis Fong, there were some LAN tournaments, and then he basically got more of a head start with the professional game, because at that time, John Carmack, who did Doom 2 and Quake, they had tournaments, and then the Red Annihilation tournament, which Dennis won the Ferrari, and he just started a podcast very similar to this too. Cool. We'll shout that out too. He was very good with the press runs when it came to the mainstream, so he really capitalized that. So while something like Starcraft and Magic had more legs than Quake over the course of gaming history, he capitalized on like the media stuff, which
that makes me think of Kibler being so good at the well-rounded full package when it comes to both public facing and understanding design super well and being a competitor, right? He's like, yeah.
So yeah, again, like, we're not surprised with like Brian Kibler, and I'm in contact with him. I wanted to get him on Live at the Bike, and people just like don't. For as big as these guys are, they're kind of like underrated in the grand scheme of like 7 billion people, in my opinion.
Yeah, funny. Yeah. So speaking of Quake, I went to QuakeCon '98. It was awesome. Our team got second place in the team event, and yeah, I remember it was just such a big deal. There's like 500 of us on this like giant, room, right? Almost like an airplane hangar. All brought our computers. It was just, I don't know, it was one of the most amazing weekends, right? Just everybody's into the same games. There's a lot of Starcraft being played, believe it or not, in addition to Quake.
I believe it. I just it's like, I realize all these games are like a different environment, and I like watching Dennis Fong play in person. So my history with him is like, I obviously heard about him, and then he started gamers.com with his brother and a couple other people, and Starcraft was just getting hot in 1998, and I was a top player, but there were no competitions yet. So I was really active on the forum. I think they thought I was talking a big game, and you hear this too, like, there's big talkers everywhere, and so in the beginning they're like, oh yeah, and then I started being in the community, and I started competing. So then I started splitting off in different directions too, whereas like I was not just a competitor, I was a community person, and literally the front page of esports for Starcraft. So that's something where people who are there know about it, but it might have been like lost in history, and like I know Brian Weissman's been a very big component that I need to grab what I deserve, so to say, with recognition.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, documenting that does feel important. I mean, it is interesting, right? Because it was right before, it was the very beginning of pro gaming, essentially, and it's right before everything was going to get documented by the internet.
Right. So
time. Yeah.
It is documented on like Wayback Machine and stuff like that, but yeah, it's just like I was literally the front page and the go-to for Starcraft strategy and the front lines of competition. So I don't know, like, that's something that's probably not as documented or underrated that I just would want to.
So I remember we played a bit back then. I forget the name of the channel. I assume it was just an IRC channel. Incinerate Rose, was that her name? Hung out in there.
Rose was in there. She was Tantalus's girlfriend at the time, I think. I don't know. Like, this is one thing, because real-time games meant so much to me, and I talked about this with Chris Brewer on the Live at the Bike Poker App podcast. I was so, cuss word, hyper competitive in these games. I had to be the best in real-time games. For Command & Conquer, Warcraft 2, I didn't get enough time, but people considered me a top player. And then Starcraft was like, everybody gets to start off on a fresh foot. So awesome. Yeah, so I don't know. I definitely was in IRC channel, plus BattleNet channels, plus Cali was Catan's Lair, and yeah, I went hard, and obviously I had some success, and then it came to a point where this is the whole reason the podcast is like financially at some point you got to wake up and be like, can I do this for a living? And
Right.
there was an option to move to Korea, but the .com boom was happening. One thing being Asian, I'm not allowed to. I'm supposed to finish college, or there's great shame. So that wasn't really an option.
Yeah.
And even to like the way that my life turned out, it was an impossibility because it took, like, my family just never recognized my international achievements.
Okay, sure.
And that was just like a massive civil war, and just like it didn't matter. Like when somebody becomes world champion or world class or even number one in the nation in something,
Right.
it's time to let go of preconceived notions, but they just wouldn't.
Right. Yeah.
But enough about the
Interesting.
Asian stuff. Like, yeah, that's basically I'll have this in my own video, but recounting, there was a lot of crossover with the Magic people. Obviously, like,
Right.
you, John Finkel, Brian Kibler, we could tell are very talented, but real-time games is a completely different animal, in which that was the late 90s was the pioneer phase.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah, I miss it so much, man. I love the pioneer phase. Yeah, I remember chatting with you, and you're like, okay, you wanted to pit me against Rose to see how good I was.
did I? Okay, I don't even remember.
Yeah.
I'm
And
gonna
so
one before you continue, I'm gonna disclaimer myself.
Uh-huh.
I'm so hyper competitive with real time games, but I'm also massive imposter syndrome. So in my memory of playing, I only lose. Like 90% of the games I lose and 10% I win.
Right. So if I ever beat you, I might not have known it was you. We might have played on ladder or something, but I lost every game, just so you know, that we played where I knew it was you, where it said so-so.
Yeah.
Or so-so wacky.
All my names were that. I guess there might have been like one random ass.
Okay.
Like, no, I think those were all my.
We probably didn't play too much randomly on ladder, but yeah, I remember. You pitted me against Rose, and then you played me, and you just went Zerglings and beat me, and I was so embarrassed. And
I don't
yeah.
know why you'd be embarrassed.
I was just like, for my one game against you, I wanted to, where you're gonna test me against you, and I lost. But yeah, I miss those days, man. It was awesome. Yeah, super fun.
Like this is the one thing that, and you know this from being a gaming competitor too, is in real-time games, it's what's hard to express is that a lot of people that like lose to me and Jay Severson and probably Gurr and others, they're always like, oh, he's not that good, I almost beat him. I'm like, you didn't even survive this juncture. Right. Do you know how much deeper our playbooks are?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't consider like it like, oh, you lost to Zerglings. It was like, obviously for the time period we were way ahead. Like I'm talking about me, Gurr, Jade, and Maynard were way ahead of the curve. So there's definitely a lot of like predominantly macro management strategy and then micromanagement that you may not have been exposed to. But it's not to say if you don't play like 5 or 10 more games, you're not gonna
sure
catch up or get better. Like one of the big misnomers about gaming and intelligence is like access to information versus adjustment to information.
Sure.
Which you and you're clearly adjusters.
Yeah, like I said, I was tier 2. I was exposed to a decent amount of that and watching it and playing against it, right? Because I played so many games. Like I came up with some of the stuff on my own, right? I was beating a lot of people, especially Zerg, basically doing second command center before factory, which was not very common, right? A lot of people were not doing that back then, and combining with a marine rush and then going into science vessels. So it's just something that people weren't encountering. And then luckily Gurr went mutas, which is not good against mass science vessel, it turns out. And but it was fun. And like a hold position, right? SSSSS on your lurkers, right? Things like that that people didn't know about, right? Coming up with that, I know a lot of people also came up with that, but miss those days.
There was a lot of I have not paid attention to the scene because when I cold turkeyed it, I couldn't. There's a lot of it's like painful to like I guess look back, especially, and that's kind of why I guess escaped to turn-based and RNG games like poker, Magic, Hearthstone, because I didn't have the pressure of having to be like having to enter that competitive mindset again. But you know, like I wouldn't like put it past you guys. Like I'm guarantee you, like top competitors, especially for every game, when they look at a top competitor like entering their space, it's like a pleasure to watch them kind of adapt things. There's definitely no belittling, and there's no like like, oh, you can't do this. This is like you're in this space. Like obviously with real-time games, there's a level of actions per minute that everyone's naturally capped, whereas like turn-based games, you know, like it's easier to transition to turn-based games than turn-based games to real-time games. But yeah, no, it's
my APM is so bad now, it's hilarious.
That's why I can't play. I have
average well below 100. I'm sure you're way faster than me, but yeah, I won the. I mean, this is a while ago. I won the PAX Starcraft 2 tournament, and which was cool. Husky was casting us. This was a while ago, but Husky was casting it, so I felt like, wow, I won an actual event. And just hands down of the people who made top 8, I had by far the lowest APM, right? Because I'm just like not trying to click, but also just they're clicking. They're just young and clicking fast. Yeah. But yeah, it was cool. I won the tournament.
Those yeah, because like Jay Severson was faster than me, and as a top StarCraft competitor, I was like in between. Obviously, compared to a normal person, I'm really fast, but that's just one of the limiting factors in what makes especially StarCraft unique, because there's no one to blame if you lose.
Right.
Whereas
yeah, I like that too. Yeah, and I play a variety of games where some you have an easy blame, obviously Magic and Hearthstone, right? As opposed to StarCraft, where it's harder. I got unlucky is a harder claim to make, right? There is luck, obviously, but
yeah, there is. There's definitely a minor amount of luck, but you know, I put that on my Twitter. I'm like, poker and Hearthstone, Magic, you can blame variants. League of Legends, you could blame your teammates. But like StarCraft, you can't blame anything. Well, this moves on to a topic as we start as competitive gamers, moving on to game design. There's a lot of pitfalls and fallacies of. Obviously, we have a head start as a competitive gamer, but meritocracy, and this is a topic that you wanted to bring up, is like how much randomness do you need to put in to make a successful game?
Yeah, so randomness is super interesting. So speaking of fallacies, one of the big fallacies is the best game is the one that's purely fair, purely skill testing, purely chess-like type of experience, right? And the truth is, I think for most games, different games are successful for different reasons, but for a lot of games, it is actually the drama, right? It's the story, it's the hope and the frustration and the fear that makes you come back, right? And so these are things that you will not see many pro players talking about, like, oh, this game would be better if it had more drama and fear in it. Just no pro player is going to say that about a game. But as a game designer, that's often, right, especially the ones I respect the most, that's often what they're talking about, right? Are you on the edge of your seat? Are you excited about what might happen next, right? And checkers only goes so far with that, right? Checkers is a great game, but eventually you run out of that, right? You're like, okay, I kind of see what can happen in checkers, and now I know the game states that are kind of decided. You lose that fun eventually, at least most people do. As opposed to a game like Hearthstone, Magic, or StarCraft, where you are constantly on the edge of your seat, right? Like most games of StarCraft against equal skill players, right? It is like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And eventually you get into a spot where it's like, okay, now I know what's going to happen. Somebody's won. But for most of the time, the drama is high. So how do you make a game where the drama is high? Randomness is a huge tool for that. You don't have to have it, but randomness is why a game like Hearthstone is so popular, right? A lot of people would hate to hear that or to believe that, but it's absolutely true, right? And you can go too far, right? I forget her name. This really smart game designer up in Seattle gave a talk on this. I could remember her name eventually, but her background is neuroscience. So she's talking about kind of the chemicals that go through your body and your brain when you have these different experiences, right? Like if you watch a horror movie versus you open a Christmas present, et cetera, what's going through your mind and your body, and what drives us to try again, right? Which is so much of the key when you're trying to design a game that's as replayable as a game like Hearthstone or StarCraft. What is it that makes you want to play a second time versus the card games that you and I maybe have played throughout the years as we try different card games that are fun, but I don't really want to play the 13th game. I'm done now, right? Why is it, right? And there's a ton of those, right? We can list probably, if we give us enough time, 100 of them that have really cool ideas, but they're just not replayable, right? Why does Hearthstone pull ahead of those? And so part of it is the frustration. So when I come into a position in Hearthstone, I'm like, oh, my only way to win is if my bomber actually hits this guy twice. Let's see if it happens. Oh, of course it didn't. It shot my own guy twice, but didn't hit his guy at all. Hit my own board only. Okay. And it's super frustrating. But at the end of that, you go, well, I knew the right order to play the cards in to maximize my odds, which Bomber's very good at doing that. Right. If you know Bomber, right, it's the shoot 3 things at random.
Yeah.
Other than himself, players included, heroes included. And then next game I go, well, maybe I could get luckier. Maybe I can make the game unfold in a way where my odds are even higher, right? What is my future? Do I have hope for the future? And that is so much of it, right? My frustration is high, but is my hope kind of competing with that frustration in a way that combos into, but yeah, you know what I mean? Like this feeling of like, damn it, but let's try again, which, how many times have you felt that in Starcraft or Magic where the game ends, you're like, okay, let's try again. I got a new idea. I have something I want to try, right? And so arguably some of the best games of all time are the ones we're talking about with that type of feeling. So as frustrating as randomness is, it is a key ingredient to replayability. It doesn't have to be the only way to do it. And there's good ways and bad ways to do it, right? I think for pro players, you can definitely make an argument that Yogg-Saron is not the right way to do it, right? Where it's like the casters are now announcing the coin flip that's about to occur, right? Do you want that to happen too much? Maybe that's okay once in a while, but not okay half the time, right? You know what I mean? That's way too much if it's half the time. Comparing that to Discover, right? So Discover, if people don't know it, right? It's the 3 cards kind of generated at random from some range, and then you pick one and it goes to your hand. So the randomness is very high. It's 3 cards that maybe you never would have put in your deck, or maybe some card you never literally ever even played before, but is good in a situation, right? That you might pick. It's 3, so skill is coming in. Which of these 3 is the best and why, right? Do I take the 9-cost card or the 2-cost card I can cast next turn, right? There's a lot of skill, a lot of debate from top-level players to make that decision. And you pay the mana cost of the card. This is very different than the highly random cards like Yogg-Saron, where you're not paying mana cost on the next 58 mana worth of spells that are about to be cast. You pay the mana cost. So the unfairness feel isn't super high with Discover. Sometimes it is when you get the perfect polymorph in the World Championships, but it still has so much of what you need from the unknown, frustration, hope, and fear element. So I think finding great ways to introduce randomness that keep you on the edge of your seat, like Discover does, I think it's one of the best card game mechanics of all time, is important, right? And so what are those, and how do you, maybe even core engine design, like if you're making a new game, how do you do that, right? I think Hearthstone Battlegrounds is kind of that, right? It's a drafting game where you are constantly rolling and hoping and trying to make decisions that are not easy, right? Even if you're a pro player, the new board is still a new puzzle enough of the time that it stays entertaining, right? That's why people like Sidich and Crip can play their 1,000th hour and still have a lot of fun. That's actually the type of game I'm working on. So I want to make an auto battler that's clear in terms of feedback, but also captures a lot of the fun of what Hearthstone Battlegrounds has done in terms of drafting a team and making it organizing them in the right order, right? So just to go into that a little bit, we're basically making a game that adds some of the other dimensions that Battlegrounds is missing, right? So Battlegrounds doesn't have things like Magic has enchantments, right? Or spells or whatnot, right? Trying to combine more dimensions to make a slightly more complex game that hopefully adds a lot more depth. And then making the positioning of your characters more obvious, like why it matters, while also being more challenging. So basically we have a front row, back row, and the guy behind your guys in front is helping those guys. So you can have a support mechanic. So he says the 2 guys, right, imagine bowling pins, so you have a 4 and a 3. So the back row, each guy's behind 2 guys in front of him, right? So those guys can help the guys in front. So where do you put who, where, why does it matter, right? And so our goal is basically to make something that's very intuitive, right? I see the front row, they're going to fight first. I see the back row, they're going to help out, right? They're going to be the support characters. And then, but also make it very hard for people like Matt Nass and Josh Uderlayton, who are at the tippity top in terms of skill at games like Magic, make it very hard for them while being very obvious what your goals are for a low-level player. So that's our goal, right, is to kind of crack the code of why are auto battlers so fun and how do we take it to the next level. Hopefully we're in that Wild West moment, and hopefully we can be, and that's our goal, right, is to be the one who goes, oh, wow, they really upgraded the genre. That's what we're
when you release, just let me know. I'll shout it out on Live with the Bike and other stuff. So there was, I don't know if you're allowed to talk about, just after Grind Gear Games, Brian Weissman did talk that you had a project in Colorado.
Oh yeah, so I went to work on as the lead for a game called Eternal, And so that's a TCG that didn't do as well as we were hoping. I mean, it's still around, they're still making money, so it did all right, right? 5 years later, 6 years later. But yeah, basically the goal with that was how do you take a hardcore TCG and make it good for digital space, right? Digital only space.
Yeah.
So we started working on that we were essentially commissioned to make a game for one of the top 3 game companies in the United States that I won't name, because they wanted a card game. The story there is that game got canceled once Hearthstone came out. So we had a lot of this digital only space stuff. Then Hearthstone comes out. And I tell this story, by the way, to Ben Brode, Mike Donay, and Eric Dodds, right? We're all out to lunch one morning. And I'm like, yeah, my game got canceled with the other company, basically because of you guys, when you guys launched Hearthstone. And they all laughed with joy. They were all like, that's a great story. I'm like, wait, my game got canceled. I don't know how great the story is. But no, they're good dudes. It was funny. But yeah, they just basically taken it to such a high level that our game didn't look very good next to it, right? So they had advanced it much more than we had, especially when it comes to like polish, feeling like a video game, being very intuitive for somebody who hasn't played TCGs, right? Hearthstone just blew us out of the water. So we transitioned. We said, okay, well, let's take a lot of our ideas and make our own game, our own new game. And yeah, we made Eternal. We made a few other games. I was working, my boss, Paul Denon, who has since made some board games and other games that are all winning awards and people just love. I don't know if you've heard of Clank, the board game. It's a deck builder. People love it. It's super popular. He's made a few others I think people are going crazy for.
There's so many games out there.
So many games. There's infinite games.
Back in the 90s, like there were predominantly, it was like, Doom, Quake, Starcraft, Street Fighter, Magic.
Right.
I'm not sure if there are any others. So basically, if you hit all those, and then, poker, if you hit all those, you're a gamer. But now it's just like too many yeah. games, too many genres. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I did that for a while, and then they recruited me at Blizzard to go work on Hearthstone, which was a dream come true to work at Blizzard and learn so much from those guys. So I did that for a while, and then essentially once, I don't know how much I can say about it, but basically, Grinding Gear Games paid out, right? So we all, basically I sold my shares, right? So, and then I decided, I want to do my own thing. I want to maybe retire / work on my own stuff. So I worked on a paper card game for a while. But then earlier this year, really kicked it up into high gear to form Good Luck Games, and am working on the game Storybook Brawl with the guys I mentioned earlier and a few other people. So yeah, got our own startup, and yeah, it's been really fun. And it's so fun too, just to feel like, okay, we're working with a genre that has a lot of hopefully low hanging fruit, right? The auto battler kind of card game space, and okay, how can I put all this stuff I learned from all these super smart people over the years to work, right? And so, yeah, I love this position, and we have enough money to just kind of do what we want. We're not beholden to anyone. So it's kind of a perfect storm in terms of like how fun it is to work on a game, which is already fun inherently to be a game designer. But this is like, yeah, as good as it gets.
Were you inspired, like what juncture were you inspired to, I guess, transition from competitor into game design? I know you touched up on like the Diablo, like, past the Diablo.
Yeah, it really didn't happen until I started working at Wizards did my passion for game design kind of explode, which is interesting, right? I think a lot of people these days are like, oh yeah, my dream job is to go work at Wizards or Blizzard or whatever, Riot or whatever.
Yeah.
For me, it was like, I mostly wanted to be around those people, right? So when I was playing competitive Magic, I got to be around, Chris Pikula, Brian Weissman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just people who are really smart and very passionate about the same thing I am, right? There's almost nothing better than that, right? And I knew at Wizards that still existed, right? I was good friends with Rosewater back in the day. Wanted to be around him, wanted to just listen, learn, hang out, play Magic, right? It just sounded like a dream job. In a lot of ways, it was right away, just being around those guys and learning. But then, like I was talking about with the release of Fifth Dawn, the third set in the Mirrodin block being such a disaster, it really piqued my curiosity. It's like, okay, well, how do you crack that? Okay, there's a puzzle to solve here, right? And so in that first year, I got a lot more excited about it. I learned a ton from Brian Schneider, and also learned a lot of what you shouldn't do. So for a while, just funny stories like this. For a while at Wizards, they not only had artists. I don't know if you know about this, but artists would get paid based on how many times their art was printed.
I remember.
So
yeah.
Yes. So in the early days, maybe they got $2,000 for a print run of Alpha or Ice Age, right? But then these contracts, once Magic was gigantic, if they wanted to reprint a card in, say, Mirrodin, the print runs were so much larger, it was going to cost like if I should say the numbers, but I heard, like $80,000 for one piece of art because of how the contract's written and because of how, once the game is way bigger in the US and is global and translated into 17 languages at the time, I believe.
Yeah.
Right. The price just got outrageous. So had to recommission art or make a new deal, yada, yada, yada.
I remember that.
They also did a version of this for designs. So they had, if your design got picked to be put into a set, you got paid.
Wow.
Well, this is a terrible incentive, right? Because there's 5 people in a room arguing about which cards should be in the set. It's like, oh, really? You want your card to be in the set? How interesting. Yeah. That's the one you're arguing for.
Yeah.
And so that had become very sour. And Brian Schneider, I don't know how much he led it, but he was very much the lead when I was there as a, do not get anywhere near that. If you design a card, don't ever argue for it in a meeting room. Turns out that's not the perfect way to do it. But right, if you just have people who are all acting in good faith, you can do whatever, right? And that's eventually, you should hire that team. But that's a lot of what I got exposed to. But the drama and the challenge of like, how do you make a good set? What are we doing wrong? Really inspired me, right? And I love it to this day, right? It's so fun to talk about. When Artifact was being released, right? That's all I want to do is just like talk with other game designers about like, what are they doing right and what are they doing wrong, right? And before the game got released, I was just baffled. Like, I was like, this game seems atrocious to me. What's going on? They've got a ton of money to
develop,
to push it, right? Yeah. It's got amazing names, right? I have tons of respect for Scaff Elias, who made the Pro Tour for Magic, and of course Richard Garfield, one of the best designers of all time. But this game just seems so bad. What am I missing, right? And of course the game comes out and flops, and it's like almost a sigh of relief. You're like, okay, good, I'm not an idiot. But it's just. But I love that. I love guessing. Like, is this game going to be successful or not? Why? Why is this game that is successful so good? Right? Playing games that are successful that you maybe don't like. And trying to figure out, okay, what do other people like about it? How do I expand my skill set by playing this game?
It's definitely a big thing because we all have cognitive biases. Like Brian Weissman did mention, like the one genre he doesn't like is match three games, like stuff like that. Yeah. One cognitive bias that's against me is like I don't like I don't feel attached to like the MMORPG genre,
right?
Which is like, it seems like that's like a big bad thing to not
sure
understand or be in. Like there's a tipping point. Obviously a lot of people waste their lives away on those things, but like having like no affinity towards it is, unbiasedly not a good thing.
Well, it makes sense to me, right? Like you're very focused on the competitive side, and 0.0001% of the people who play WoW get to experience the competitive side, right? 99.999% of people are playing the grind collectathon, whatever you want to call it, right? Maybe social is actually what you should put first. I feel it. I do enjoy MMOs, but I fall out of them way faster than most people. Do I understand why MMOs are good? Maybe. Not as well as other people. Yeah.
That's one thing I like to ask people. It's like, what entrances you about MMOs? Right. Because like all the other ones, even Magic, I do understand why it entrances me. So I did want to ask from a design perspective for Magic is like, I'm definitely more of like watching things happen and as they unfold. So obviously some sets get praised more than other sets and other sets get panned. Like as a designer, how does it feel to get your set praised versus panned, and then how do you feel about it? Or is it just there's a one dimension that is sales that as a player you don't feel, but as the back end you really, really feel.
Right. Well, it's super important, right? It's like, I think with an artist or anybody that's putting something out there that's like, I worked on this is part of me. Right. Now what do you guys think? With Eventide, which was I was lead final designer on, it was not super well received. It didn't have great sales, and it hurts, right? To this day, my brain goes back and thinks about it, like, what was I thinking? Why didn't I make a better set? Why didn't I help make a better set? But yeah, it feels great, working on Zendikar, and my first lead actually was during the original Ravnica block. Super proud of that. Just people loving it and going crazy for it. It feels wonderful, right? And it's a huge percentage of the motivation to try to get better. Like, I want more of the accolades and less of the hate, right?
I remember at least Ravnica. I mean, I obviously have a lot of memories for the Magic sets I participated in. I do remember Ravnica, like, a lot of designs were, like, memorable, I guess. That was but the same thing, like, when you mentioned for Invasion. For Ravnica, like Lightning Helix, right? And Dimir Guildmage, just the Guildmage
Yep, love it.
cycle. There's like a lot of stuff that was like, very memorable. And speaking of Dimir Guildmage, like Brian Weissman, like Cube Draft was something that I created or I pushed for, and Brian Weissman
That's
really
awesome.
wants me to get credit for that.
Yeah.
And I called it the Cube, obviously, as a tribute to the deck to
Right.
start.
Okay. I did not know that. That's awesome.
Oh, you didn't know that I created Cube?
No, and I didn't. Well, yeah, I didn't know that it was called the Cube.
Oh yeah, it was called like.
That's cool.
So this is how all of our history ties together. So I think in 2004-ish, I wanted a draft set with like one of every card, and then I would email Brian Weissman. I told John Sasso at Superstars and now Channel Fireball, I'm like, I want to do this thing. And then John's like, okay. I'm like, don't worry, I'll buy the cards from you.
Yeah.
Which is, what he probably cares about the most. And then it like at some point, I had these physical boxes of, those 5 by whatever. And then I was dragging around 3, and then it became too impractical. And then basically somewhere along the line, like it just developed into the thing. And then Brian kept trying to say like, oh yeah, it was Wayne's idea, but like at that point I was like fairly inactive. I was doing other stuff like not related to gaming. So
well, it's huge now. People go crazy for Cube.
Yeah. Well,
awesome.
Started here. Game designer. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, that's like I was never. This is why I asked you and Brian Weissman like what caused the shift from competitive game designer, because I was kind of like never tasked with game design, and then Jay Severson had Gambit.com, and he started tasking me to do this stuff, and I'm like, oh, so I found out I did have stuff to offer,
cool.
But it we'll see if it manifests. Like I have a game license to Commerce Casino that's waiting to launch, but
oh wow,
it's kind of like until you're tasked to do something, then which is like your experience of Wizards, until you actually do it and you just like realize it's out there and on the table, you don't really necessarily know it exists.
Yeah, and what does it mean to be a game designer? I didn't understand that when I first got to Wizards, right? And definitely didn't understand before I got to Wizards. And yeah, like you said, once you're tasked with it, once you start working on it, all the dimensions you weren't thinking about before become some of them you become hyper aware of, right? Like, why do people like this and not that? Like when you have to actually put it down in front of a player and they're going to be the judge and not you arguing on a forum, right?
Yeah.
Everything changes, right? Your perspective has to change, and you need to become more open-minded. You need to become open to being wrong and changing your mind and learning from other people, right? If you want to actually get good. And and I really appreciate those years, right? Basically 2003 to 2006 is when I was transitioning from, competitive player to game designer, right? And, listening to Robert Gutierrez, who would go on to work with Mike Donay. Mike Donay is one of the top designers at Blizzard.
I email with him occasionally. I'm just kidding. I'm not kidding. I did. Like I think I told you about this. I had like had a little bit of interest in designing for Hearthstone, but it's not.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, he basically made Battlegrounds, right? So huge hit. And he's been working the major designer on Hearthstone for a long time now. But learning from all these people and basically discovering a new puzzle that's just super fun, that has high stakes. In a lot of ways, it's like being a competitive gamer, right? I want to win is going through your head, right? At the same time, how do I make this the best? And I've had a lot of failure, a lot of success, and I hope to succeed here with this game with Storybook Brawl. It's super fun, and it is in a lot of ways it's the bigger game than competitive gaming. Like it's killed. I was already kind of falling out of competitive gaming, but it's in a lot of ways killed my desire to be good at competitive gaming. Part of it is the payoff. When you think about what can I win, right? Per effort. And it's like I'm already on the track for game design, but it turns out that if you make a fun game, it can be replicated with electrons through computers and the internet. The potential is just outrageous, right? Looking at gunning your games, like, oh, if instead of 10,000 people you're playing your game on a Saturday morning, it's 194,000, suddenly the value you're creating for the company is just through the roof, right? So yeah, it's super fun how how do you do that? How do you get that good? It's just an awesome puzzle. Yeah, I love it.
So sorry, back to the magic. Like I
Yeah,
keep sidetracking because one of the
yeah, no
focal
worries.
points is what did you learn from a development process, starting from I guess the first set and like some of the fallacies that you might have had? Because I run into this too. I talked about with Brian Weissman. It's like as a competitor, we unfortunately skew some designs toward meritocracy, and we quickly learn that that's not the way to do
Yeah,
things.
right. Yeah. So, yeah, some of the things that I learned early on is just how much a good top down or the flavor of the card matters, right? Um, and designing to that, like, yeah, just to kind of to zoom out. You're working on a new Magic set. Maybe you already have the theme, right? It's going to be space dragons, whatever it's going to be, and before you have your first idea, how many possible ideas could you have that are good, that can get developed and shaped, as a piece of clay into a great design? And the answer is not 245 or whatever the set size is. There's not 245 that you have to find exactly each one that exists. The answer is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of potential ideas that all have the potential to be A pluses, maybe, right? Or at least A minuses, right? If you do it right, if you balance them, get the right art for them, right? Have resonant design in terms of the art matching up with the mechanics, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're starting that far away, you want to hit the home run on all the different dimensions, right? You want, speaking of dragons, the form of the dragon type card, which is so interesting in terms of like, wow, I've never seen a card like this. It's blowing my mind in just its newness of mechanics.
It was Onslaught, right?
What was it? Wow.
Form of the Dragon was red, red, red 4. Is that the one I'm thinking?
Yes.
Yeah, and
I'm
then
pretty
bring
sure it's 7 mana triple red. Is it Onslaught? I'm embarrassed I don't remember which set it was, but
it's
I don't
okay.
think it's Onslaught. Maybe it is.
There's
No,
way too many Magic cards.
Aaron Forsythe designed it. I know that. I feel like he was designing after Onslaught, but you might be right.
Let me do a really fast Google. I
You're gonna
remember I love that card, like the
Yeah.
design.
Yeah, it's so cool, right? And it's got the moat / deal 5. Your health becomes 5. You are the dragon, right? It's form
Yeah.
of the dragon. The resonance to the top down and the mechanics is so good and so unique, right? That it's just inspiring. That's the type of Magic card that when you ship it, there's a bunch of people that are going to get more into Magic or stay hooked to Magic longer because it's just like Magic cards can be this cool. So when you're, blue sky, 1,000 feet up, what designs do you want to make? What are you going to create that can hit on all the cylinders, right? Be a great top down, be super fun, show off power without being overpowered, right? Which there's tricks to do that. Finding those is something I never would have occurred to me when I first started developing Magic. And you had mentioned a couple cards just real quick. I was thinking about. You mentioned Lightning Helix and this cycle.
It's from Scourge. It's from Scourge.
Oh, so it is that block. Of course, it's Scourge.
Yeah.
That's the Dragon set. Yeah, I played a lot of that block. I'm surprised I didn't know that. But anyways, you'd mentioned Lightning Helix, right? 2 mana, right? Red, white.
Yeah.
RW, we say in R&D. RW to cast, deal 3 instant, heal 3 to your player total, and then the Guild Mages. Super interesting. So Helix is a phenomenal design. It's a 9.5, depending on the format, right, out of 10. Right, it's a very powerful, right? You're going to see it in most formats just because it's so incredibly powerful. But it's a great place to put power because its potential to ruin games, its potential to shift a game that was one way, it's not like balance at all, right? When I draw it when I have 7 mana, it is not the best card I could have drawn. You know what I mean? As opposed to Ancestral is always the best card you could draw, right? The problem cards are always the best card you could draw, right? So this is a great place to put power, right? It's also gold, so you need to not only have these two colors, but you need to have them on turn 2, which is not always guaranteed. And to make casting that card on turn 4 when you finally draw your red source is not the reason this card is powerful. It's because of how good it is on turn 2, in addition to the mid and late game, where it starts to scale down, obviously. And people see that, right? When I was walking to the pre-release for Ravnica, super excited to see what people think. The group of guys in front of me were telling their friend about this card. That's super, by the way, that's super good feedback for me, right? Like, oh, this is the card they choose to talk about. This is the card that has them inspired. It's Lightning Bolt, Healing Salve, all in one card, totally unfair, right? Instant. It just reads unfair to people. Yeah. As opposed to the Guild Mages, which in some ways are the opposite. So Guild Mages, were they powerful? Oh, goodness, yes. 2 mana 2/2 with somewhat easy to cast mana cost, right? Hybrid, right? W green for the best one, at least in tournaments back then, Selesnya Guildmage. We launched that card, and I think Lightning Helix at the time, so this is how we would measure. When you work at Wizards, you're not supposed to talk about secondary market, but it was a great way to measure popularity, right? I could go into more of that too. But so Lightning Helix, I think, was $2 or $3, right? Very expensive for an uncommon. Selesnya Guildmage, also an uncommon, was a quarter. It was about to go win Worlds that year, right? 4 copies in the best deck, right, at Worlds, right? The deck win. But it was a quarter, and maybe it went up to 50 cents afterwards. Well, why is that? It's because a 2-mana 2/2 is not exciting.
Yeah.
Making a 1/1 token for 4 mana is way overcosted. A 1/1 doesn't even cost 1, let alone 4 mana. Do you see what I'm saying? And these don't resonate with people, right? But of course, it's the options, right? If you have the option, right? If your ace can be at 11 or a 1, suddenly it's the best card in poker because of the option. Not just ones are good, sure, but having the potential to be a 1 is incredible. So that's a lot of the power in Selesnya Guildmage. But the world didn't agree, right? They're like, no, I don't care that it won Worlds. I'm not going to pay more than 50 cents for this card, right? Okay, well, what do you learn from that, right? So there we were putting power in a way that wasn't splashy. Well, that doesn't mean it's a bad design. It's just very important to understand you're not putting splash here, as opposed to Lightning Helix, where you're like, hey, we're shipping what we think is a 9, right? And we're getting all the payoff in terms of perception. And perception matters so much, right? One of the big mistakes from the last 2 years is Oko. I don't know if you know this card. It's pretty famous in the Magic world.
Brian Weissman re-educated me. I followed cards very sporadically, but my Twitter feed, when something is completely off the deep end for Hearthstone and Magic, boom, and that's one of the Oko, I guess, makes a 0/1 food, and then you could you gain loyalty, and you also gain loyalty by making something a 3/3,
right? And it turns out this is very powerful, not only because turning 5/5 flyers into 3/3s is good, but once again, it's a planeswalker with multiple choices, right? That are all turns out very good, and he's hard to deal with because he comes out and has 5 loyalty right away, 5 health right away. And eventually they banned him because he's too good. But part of the problem with him is if you show that card to somebody who's not very good at Magic, let's say they're medium or less, right? And for some reason they've been, trapped in ice. They didn't know about how popular and how unfair it was and how it needed to be banned. And you just show them and you go, hey, how does this compare to Shivan Dragon? A lower level player is not going to go, oh my God, I can turn things into 3/3. This is the best card ever. It's like, food can heal you for 3. They don't know the synergies. So they weren't cashing in on power in terms of first blush. This is super splashy high power. They were spending, right? It was an 11 out of 10, right? They were spending a lot of power points. This is not the right way to make Magic sets, right? Sometimes it's going to happen. It's part of the range when you're doing a job making Magic. You're going to make this mistake some of the time. Right? Sure. I certainly did. Umezawa Jit, is I think even worse design than Oko, and I was all for it, right? I didn't understand, but and I can tell you the stories on that and how we do that. It's very embarrassing.
Definitely want to hear that. But go ahead.
But very embarrassing. Oh my goodness.
Keep going to Oko. Let's hear.
So Oko, and then has the other problem, which is he's the face of the set in some ways. So how do you ban him? They recorded voice lines for him in Magic Arena. How do you ban this guy, right? So they kind of had to live through the pain a little longer, right? It's very hard to go, hey, this, I don't remember what it got up to, $60, $70? I don't know. How do we ban this card when it's so popular? How much damage is it doing to Standard, right? How much damage is it doing to people wanting to play Magic? Yeah. And so it's a prime example of spending points the wrong way, as opposed to, if we picked our favorite 3 dragons, right? They're almost certainly a great way. Actually, the first set that I was actually on for the full time, well, not even the full time, but all close to being the full time, was the original set for Champions of Kamigawa, which I think is quite a bad set. But the dragons, I think, are all-stars there, right? They're legends that actually pay you off for having the legend rule, right? And on opening day, Kakoshu, the black one, Kakosho? I'm forgetting.
It's Kakoshu because I played in the block constructed and I top 8'd that. So.
Okay, so you played with or against it a bunch.
I played with it. Yeah, we had. Anyway, go on. Yeah.
And his drain for 10, once you play the second one and block, is absolutely incredibly powerful, right? The counterplay wasn't quite there. We didn't have enough exile to make it a great counterplay card. Had we had Oblivion Ring, right? Had we had counterplay, I think it would have been even better design. But it opened up at $20, right? Which is basically the cap back then. Things changed afterwards, but $20 is a great price to open at. So people thought it was an exciting design, right? It's also a 6-mana 5/5 flyer. And legend mattered too, right? There were ways to cash in on it being a legend. and kind of the grindy raised dead deck made good use of it. Green black, that was the block deck. But anyways, I really like that design.
That
right?
was I did an alternate version. They had what was the blue card? The blue 3.
3U, okay.
That's the deck that ended up being the best.
Gifts Ungiven.
Gifts Ungiven, yeah. Gifts Ungiven, Kokusho was
right.
Yeah.
Black, green, blue. You were also running green for the.
The version that I used did not have Gifts Ungiven because I didn't spend enough time, but it was the same premise. It was get four Kokushos and then kill them right away. Yeah.
Into it, yeah. Kokusho I think is a good example of this. He's at least a B+ in terms of like people like him right away, and he's powerful enough to be in tournaments. That's a good synergy, but he's not so powerful. Right? He costs 6 mana and he doesn't kill you that turn, right? Unless you're casting 4 of them in a turn. There's combos with him, but generally he's a fair card. I love putting power in that space. So that was something I just didn't understand at all when I first started playing. The Umezawa Jite.
Let's hear it.
It's really bad. So we had that card probably at too hard of a power level when it was 2 mana, 2 to equip, and it would get 2 counters whenever combat occurred, just like it does now. But it made black mana instead of -1/-1ing until end of turn. So that's a bit weaker, but still quite powerful. And if we shipped that, I don't think we'd be talking about it afterwards. But it turns out, and there's 2 embarrassing pieces here. One will resonate with people, and I think the other one won't. But it turns out so you have 3 choices when you spend a counter. Do you want to giant growth your guy for +2/+2? Do you want to gain 2 health? Or do you want to give -1/-1 to a target creature until the turn? Back then it was, do you want to make a black mana? So you could make 2 black mana every time somebody got into a fight. So it was literally a dark ritual, right? Because 2 black mana is the net profit of dark ritual. It turns out you can't make mana and do normal speed, instant, right, fast effects at the same time. So when you go, I have 3 things on a list and I want to choose one, they have to be at the same speed because we're already to the point in the core engine of the game where we're making a choice. They can't be different speeds and let's go back in time and do it at a different speed. Right. Well, it turns out actually you can. You just say, this one is a fast effect. Who cares? You're adding mana at a different speed. That's okay. It is not a big deal. I'm sure tons of people would disagree with me, but it's true. So we had to change it. So we said, how about -1/-1? Sounds innocuous, doesn't sound that powerful. And then we didn't play with it. And that's truly the embarrassing thing, is we did not play with it. So my experience with that card is going to the pre-release, my opponent casting it, and me going, I have no way to win now. Wait a second, what did we do? Right? And doesn't make any sense. How do we not play a card? Isn't it our job? Like what? I mean, it's just so embarrassing on so many levels. And that was my first fear moment. Have you ever had that where you're like, oh my God, I left the fire on at my home? You know what I mean? That type of like, you're washed over with fear where you're like, what have I done?
That's probably something that, DCG, CCG designers for like Magic and Hearthstone.
Right.
I can't think of a Hearthstone card off the top of my head, which is just like, but yeah, I get it. But at the same time,
Patches is the one that I kind of feel that for. But anyways,
Patches, which one's
the pirate beholder?
Oh yeah, the charge. Yeah, that guy had problems, but it looks innocuous when you first see it. But the thing is, like, part of it is like, while you as a designer feel you left the fire on the stove, it's part of the game's history, and those moments are ones that people remember. Oh, remember Skull Clamp? Oh, remember Time Spiral? Like, how ridiculous was that? And those are things that, they were mistakes, but they also stick with you. So were they really mistakes? Because now they have historical value.
Right. They still create value to this day, both because of stories and people own them and they talk about how powerful these cards were. Yeah, so that's true. There's 2 sides to the coin. I would just rather make those stories about things that are not turning too many people away. One of the big ones were, Fifth Dawn, right? Arc Ravager being too good turned a lot of people away, right? How do you get those famously powerful cards without turning people away, right? Ancestral Recall actually being one of the most egregiously overpowered cards of all time, I don't think turned people away because Magic was a different animal back then, right? There were not many people, like, I've never heard anybody say, I quit Magic because of Ancestral Recall. And I've talked to a lot of Magic players.
That's the difference between
it's a different world.
Card draw and hand destruction. Like, hand
totally.
Destruction just
yes.
Is
you feel it. Right, but you feel it on your side of like, oh, I can't win, or land destruction, right? You feel it more than anything. Even when land destruction is fair, it feels horrible. But yeah, I think Umezawa's Jet did turn enough people away that it was a meaningful mistake. I think Skull Clamp did that to a higher degree. Part of what goes wrong is when a card like Clamp or Jet gets so famous for being overpowered, it now almost doesn't matter what the actual experience I'm having now is. I know you have that card in play, right? You see people do this when it's like, oh my God, he drew Channel. That card's banned in most formats, and he drew Channel. It's like, well, yeah, but he didn't draw Fireball. Why are you upset? It's just because the card's famous for being overpowered. He didn't do anything with Channel, yet you still list that as something that's unfair for his draw. These cards reach that level, right? One of the big ones too, after I left, was Cawblade, that deck, right? The sword, what was it? The blue-green sword, and there was the other sword. But anyways, just so much more powerful than what the other decks were doing. You saw, like I heard, it was like 50% drop in attendance for Friday Night Magic when these decks were popular. So you got to avoid that, especially in a world of paper Magic where you can't just, announce a hot fix, a week later like we could with Hearthstone.
1 second.
Yeah.